Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As always, I would like to introduce Father Jeff Langen. Father Jeff is the chaplain of the Metro Achievement Program in Chicago. He was ordained a priest in 2015, and before entering the priesthood, he served as a professor of political philosophy and liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College. He has published books and articles on topics ranging from the French Revolution and contemporary geopolitics to the role of Platonic philosophy in contemporary Iran. Tonight's discussion will answer the question, does America have a nationality problem? We're looking forward to an engaging and thought-provoking conversation this evening. Take it away, Brother Jeff.
Just to start my talk, just in the past week, I saw 3 news items that are very relevant to the subject we want to go over today. And again, the overall point of this summer's seminars, we're going through the American experience from 1900 until 2026. And I'm trying to focus on 1 or 2 key moments that bring out an important idea or an important process that we can consider right now. And just in the last week, I saw 3 or 4 items that are very relevant to what I'm calling the nationalities problem. Number 1, I saw this post on X. It was posted in June, but it was reposted just a few days ago. This post is from Eagle's Wings, not the song, right? Leftists always scream, America has sky-high murder rates because of guns. Watch this. This guy claims the U.S. is near the top globally. Then the facts hit. Remove just 5 cities, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and Philadelphia. And America drops to 189th out of 193 countries in the murder rate. What do all 5 of those bloodbath cities have in common for decades? And then he gives some problems with Democratic mayors, he says, progressive experiments, defund movements, gun control. And then he says it's a Democrat urban failure problem. The Second Amendment isn't the issue. Criminals and the politicians protecting them are. Now, what I want to suggest is obviously you can never summarize everything in an X post. But I actually think the X post misses the point. And what we want to go into today is in this book, Slaughter of Cities, which I think is the companion piece to part 3, at least the chapters 42, 44, 46 in Walking with the Bible and a Gun. What Slaughter of Cities shows is there was a plan that was put in place. And it was a plan, and in the cities that this fellow mentions, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, those cities were the cities that first implemented the plan. And the plan got out of control, as all of these concocted plans tend to get out of control. And I want to go through today, what was that plan? Another thing that I frequently get asked when I say I'm from Detroit. People will say, oh, Detroit really went bad in the 80s. And my answer is no, it's the problem there, it goes much deeper than the 1980s. It goes all the way back to the late 1930s. And we need to understand that, because it's not just all these are like these typical things, oh, the problems began in the 80s. Like those are the typical cliches of corrupt businessmen who want to explain the world to themselves in a way that doesn't explain anything. So they can just keep going around in their elitist, corrupt stupors, right? So we want to go beyond the cliches of corrupt businessmen. And another item on Substack, someone sent to me graphs about religion. A city built for a church that no longer exists. And the guy's talking about Detroit. Detroit is the typical Midwestern city where the churches were built in the city for a population of 2.5 million people, over 60% of whom were Catholic. And now the city has to reorganize. I mean, because now this in 1950, Detroit was again 2.5 million people. They built the city for expansion to about 3 million maybe or something like that. But beginning in 1950, the contraction of Detroit didn't begin in 1980. It began in 1950. By 1980, it was almost already done. So we got to explain what happened. But when people talk about, oh, the church has to reorganize, well, part of it is that the population has changed. Detroit now is a city of about 600,000 people. Right, so it went from 3 million around, or 2.5 million around 1950 to now being around 600,000. That's a huge change. So of course there's not going to be as many Catholics in the city. Another item, in recent days, another Substack author, Martyr Maid, Daryl Cooper, some people might know him, he began a series just this past week called The American Century. It's almost as if he's listening to us. But I also know that the first thing he discusses in the first essay from this week is the rise of a mass culture. I know he's drawing on this book because he quotes it, and he's quoted it in another work of his. And then finally, there's a very, I think he has some limitations, but he's pretty good on commenting on the Iran war right now. A professor at the University of Chicago called Robert Pape. And he studies the structural components of how wars escalate and also how violence can escalate also domestically. And even Robert Pape this week in his Substack started to raise the issue of both domestically and also in international politics. Given the dynamics of what's happening these days, we might see the rise, or we're going to see the rise of the nationalities problem. He used that word. And that word was first, I think, coined at the University of Chicago in the 1930s. And so that's why I want to go back a little bit and go over, I want to explain, in the case of whether you're talking about parishes in Detroit, whether you're talking about the nationalities problem, whether you're talking about the rise of mass culture, in the case of Walking in the Bible a Gun, the rise of the one chapter we dealt with this week is the Gary Cooper and the Virginian and the rise of the cowboy, which Jones says is part of the return to the satanic wilderness, and that needs to be explained. Finally, as this is all a matter of introduction, I will frequently be asked, having grown up in Detroit and then now living in Chicago, what are the differences between Detroit and Chicago? And it just strikes me, having been here for a year and a half, that in Chicago was subject to the same, got subject to the same social engineering or ethnic cleansing that Detroit got subject to, the same policy. They started to implement in Chicago, but I don't think it was as successful in Chicago as it was in Detroit. So you still see in Chicago something you don't see in Detroit, which is that you still see ethnic groups that have control of sectors of the city, both neighborhoods and also sectors of the city. And obviously it's always changing a little bit, but you take this neighborhood that we're in. Originally it was an Irish neighborhood. Then in the late 1800s it became a Polish neighborhood. And in the 1980s, 1990s, the Polish elements, for the most part, left or it kind of collapsed. Now it's a whole new beast, right? It's a whole new beast. I would say what happened here is probably more of a natural process than a forced process, which we want to discuss the forced process. In order to discuss the forced process, we need to understand that going back to the early 20th century, there were a group of thinkers and actors that were convinced that the United States was going to become the empire that replaced the British Empire on the world stage. And part of the U.S. replacing the British Empire meant the U.S. had to engage in wars, imperial wars. The first imperial war was the Spanish-American War. We all probably remember that from our history classes, how Woodrow Wilson ran for president, saying we're not going to get involved in any wars in Europe. And we know, however, that he did get us involved in the European War. And so, one more item is that if you go back to the 1820s, 1830s, that would be the time of, we would say, the first American Republic. Right? In the 1820s, 1830s, there was a series of anti-Catholic riots in the East Coast. One of the famous riots was in Philadelphia. And in that riot, they burned down an Ursuline convent. And there was such horror at the burning down of the Ursuline convent that it was not an official policy of the government, because the federal government didn't really have many official policies in these matters. But what ended up happening in the 1820s and 1830s is that the elites, the Protestant elites of this country, basically agreed that in major American cities there would be ethnic federalism, what I call ethnic federalism, that various ethnic groups would have control of their neighborhoods. And that within the context of that relative control, you'd have basic peace. I mean, there's always going to be tensions at the edges, but you'd have basic peace, and that over time, there would be assimilation. Kind of interesting here is that St. Thomas Aquinas argued way back in the Middle Ages that when you have immigrants moving from place to place, essentially it takes 3 generations for them to become true citizens. And that's kind of what happened in the United States. By the 1950s, there was this, Digby Baltzell published the book, The Triple Melting Pot, in which he said, if you look at the United States is primarily Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant. And those are now the 3 ethnic groups that all consider themselves American. In the first generation, when they come here, they tend to think of themselves more according to the homeland they come from. Irish, German, Italian, Polish. But in the second and third generation, they start to intermarry with other ethnic groups. And so by the third generation, the ethnic identification might still be there, but it's very much in the second place to their religious identification. So that's why America is, he says in the 1950s, it's Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant. Right? The triple melting pot. And so this system of ethnic federalism, it was the system in place. It was put in place in the 1820s, 1830s. That's the time when Bucktown, where we are, became an Irish neighborhood. That's why it was called Bucktown, because they had goats, right? And this persisted until the 1930s. But you can already see, right on the eve of the First World War, that there's a growing concern among the elites with the realities of ethnic federalism. And the first example, the story is very well recounted in the book Slaughter of Cities. But the first example is actually it's a seminar that John Dewey had at Columbia University with about 10 to 12 people. So much like those of us in the room right here. And in that seminar, this would have been before World War I now, 1912, 1913. Dewey at the time was very much in favor of getting the United States involved in the Great War. He was also an advocate of birth control, and he was also a kind of a bitter anti-Catholic. So Dewey in this seminar is speaking over and over again about the danger of the Catholic neighborhood. And there was a wealthy man in the seminar, Albert Barnes, who said, I have a proposition. I'm going to pay for everybody's way to go live in Philadelphia for the summer. Let's go and spend the summer studying a Polish neighborhood in Philadelphia, and let's try to figure out what's this nut and how can we crack it. So they spend the summer in Philadelphia, and one of the big things that really strikes Dewey, and that he imparts to the students by the end of the seminar, is that there's direct communication between the priest and the people. And that there's no, because the priest speaks to the people, he speaks their language, and they get their information from either the parish bulletin or the diocesan newspaper. Their social activities are connected with the parish. Their news is coming from basically the priest. And so Dewey recognizes this is a problem. There's no way we're going to be able to really influence these people if we simply have the primary means of communication being pope, bishop, priest, person. Right? We got to break that somehow. We got to replace it with something else. Now, 3 of the members of this seminar will go on to play an important role in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, specifically in breaking the means of communication that was part of the ethnic neighborhood. 2 of them are 2 brothers, Paul Blanchard and Brand Blanchard. Paul Blanchard became a leftist kind of Tucker Carlson of the 1940s and 1950s. Brand Blanchard went into urban housing or urban planning and development. And we'll speak about them in a moment. I want to speak about 2 things now that are important as far as the First World War. Number 1 are the chapters from Walking with the Bible and a Gun, Walter Lippmann, and then also Walter Lippmann and the Rise of the Cowboy. Because Walter Lippmann was hired, he and a group of other intellectuals, they were hired by Woodrow Wilson, basically to create the propaganda that was needed in order to change the mindset of Americans, to get enough of them on board with going into Europe in the First World War. And so Lippmann, I don't have the book on me, but you can access this book now online. He wrote a book called Public Opinion. He felt that his efforts were so successful in the propaganda that he developed that he put everything down in a book called Public Opinion. And in that book, he describes what he felt he was doing. He was saying, number 1, we need to get rid of the state culture in America. We need to get rid of ethnic federalism or ethnic pluralism. Why? Because too many people are getting information from too many different sources. We need to kind of constrict the lines of communication. Number 2, he said, his understanding of life was, and this goes back to the ancient world, this really isn't a new thing, but his understanding of life was, you have categories of the mind and categories of reality. He says, I really don't care too much about categories of reality. That's not my business. My business is categories of the mind. And we need to figure out ways to change what's in the mind of people. And he was, and it's quoted in Walking with the Bible and a Gun, where he basically says, we got to get rid of Jeffersonian democracy. Right? Jefferson has a number of problems, as does John Adams. We don't need to go into those here. But Walter Lippmann was very critical of Jeffersonian republicanism, Jeffersonian democracy. Because Jefferson cherished the small landowning farmers. Right? He says, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. Corruption of morals in the mass of cultivators is a phenomenon of which no age nor nation has furnished an example. Jefferson disapproved of manufacture, foreign commerce, a navy, the intangible forms of property, right? So using money in such a way that you can fraudulently get it away from people. Anything that was not centered around small self-governing groups. And again, I'm not necessarily an advocate of this, but Lippmann saw that any kind of localism, Lippmann was trying to destroy any local forms of communication in order to come up with a mass communication, mass culture. If democracy is to be spontaneous, the interests of democracy must remain simple, intelligible, and easily managed. Conditions must approximate those of the isolated rural township. So Lippmann, his proposal for this is that what we need, and this is very relevant for our own day, we need experts. We need experts who know how to cultivate democratic ideas in the minds of people. But democratic ideas that are, for example, getting them on board with going to war, right, in Europe. And Lippmann would describe things like, we got to eliminate ethnic identity. So he would describe these pageants that he would put on in the 7th inning at baseball games, where there would be like a Liberty box. And they'd have the Polish peasants walk into one end of the Liberty box, dressed in Polish mountain clothes, and they'd come out on the other side in red, white, and blue striped bowling shirts, right? And then holding the flame of liberty. And so that was like very cheap propaganda. But the whole idea was to create a national democrat, and the idea of a national democracy, a national culture. But it's very Rousseauian. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that, well, how do you have real democracy? Well, you have to have the volonté générale, the general will. Well, how do you know what the general will is? And he says it's not by counting the votes. Right? There's one man who has special insight into the majority, into the will of the general will of the people. And that's the man who's the true Democrat. And Lippmann in particular is very much a partisan of the volonté générale. You need the experts, right, who can elicit the true will of what the people want from them in the mass culture. Right? You can't leave it to ethnic neighborhoods fighting with each other, or rural communities and the rural farmers fighting with each other. So, number one, Lippmann seeking to develop this mass culture. As you read through public opinion, Lippmann shows great, as I just said, he shows a contempt for the ethnic neighborhood. We also saw Dewey and his group of seminar, they showed great contempt for the ethnic neighborhood. Lippmann wants to and at one point Lippmann also says, one of the problems too of communication right now, there's no sexual politics in it. He even uses that term. There's no sexual motif. Right, we'll get into that next time when we deal with Hollywood. Right, because Lippmann also was a partisan of using Hollywood to create mass culture. And that's a whole other story that we'll talk about. He also felt that the ethnic neighborhoods and the rural Jeffersonian Democrats, they were obstacles to corporate interests. Right? And they were obstacles to those who wanted to serve corporate interests. And while nowadays this may seem ironic that we're criticizing this, because almost every important Catholic intellectual or Catholic representative we have in Washington, D.C., they're all there serving corporate interests. Amy Coney Barrett, George Weigel, Robert George, right? All these Catholic intellectuals, they're all on the payroll of corporate interests, right? Right? And they reflect that corporate interest as they promote a certain kind of mass culture themselves. Who are they? They're loyal institutionalists, right? They're loyal to the corporate interests that put them where they are. And these corporate interests are also loyal to the empire. And part of the growth of the empire was this war on ethnic federalism, which I think persists to this day. There's one more element here that's important, which is what's going on in the mind of the Catholic leadership going into the First World War. We're all probably familiar with, we've probably at least heard about, there's the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. What was the original title of that conference? It was the National War Relations Board. It was something along those lines, right? The whole point going into the First World War, and I think there's an image here in the church which is relevant, because there's this one image as I sit as the priest on this during the readings, as I sit to the, I guess if you're in the congregation, it would be, I sit to the right of the altar, and I look at this painting that's in the sanctuary. It's to the left of the altar, and this painting to the left of the altar, it's one of the Redemptorist priests here, and he's giving a blessing, but he's giving a blessing, and to someone there is holding an American flag, and there's a soldier kind of kneeling down as he gives him his blessing, right? That is classic World War I war propaganda. And the Catholics going into World War I, they would have been, my guess is that if we were to do research, they would have been sympathetic with what Lippmann was doing and unaware of the danger in the hostility that Lippmann himself had, or people like him had, to the ethnic neighborhoods. I think they were clueless about that potential danger. I could be proven wrong, and I'd be happy to be proven wrong. And the reason I say this is that John Rayo shows this John Rayo has these lectures on the history of the church. I think they're on, I forget now what little application they're in. I'll remember in a moment. But in his lectures on the America from 1900 to 1945, he points out how the Pope was doing everything in his power to prevent World War I from happening, and once it started, he was engaged in intense diplomacy to end it. I'm not going to deal with the European countries, but the American bishops did everything they could to stop, to mute the efforts of the Pope in the United States. Part of it is that they were so eager, they were so intent on, they felt it was so important to get into good graces with the elites in DC, to get into the to get their foot in the door of the Woodrow Wilson administration, that they blocked all the efforts of the Pope to try to end the First World War. Right? Because they just felt that our chance to get in with the elites was we have to be 100% on board with all the efforts with American patriotism. Right? So they would have been on board with everything that Lippmann was trying to do, and not really even looking into what any of the anti-Catholic animus that was part of Lippmann's project, or John Dewey's project either. So World War I happens. Let's fast forward now to the mid-1930s. The middle of the 1930s, it's the Great Depression. And the Roosevelt administration, they're faced with a similar problem that Woodrow Wilson faced. They want to get into what they feel is the upcoming war. Nobody knew this at the time. There was a professor at the University of Chicago, Jacques Maritain, at the time. He was a Catholic philosopher. And in Maritain's writings, it's kind of interesting because at the time, Louis Wirth was a closet Stalinist. And in the diaries of Maritain writes these entries, and he wrote letters to people where you can read this, where he says, I imagine myself becoming a good friend with Louis Wirth, right? He's the kind of guy you can befriend. He's the kind of intellectual you can have conversations with. This is the person we need to win over. We need to get rid of all of these, bad habits that we Catholics have that prevent us from being friends with Louis Wirth. Now you read Louis Wirth's diary, his own personal diaries, and it's like letter after letter of, if there's anything that I hate in this world, it's a Catholic intellectual like Jacques Maritain, right? And then there's letters back and forth between Louis Wirth and others at the University of Chicago that he was in league with, who were doing everything they could to kick Jacques Maritain out of the university. Now, Louis Wirth was a bitter anti-Catholic because his first job was down in New Orleans at Tulane University, a Catholic school. Pardon?
Not Catholic school.
Well, what's the Catholic school in New Orleans? Whatever was the Catholic one in New Orleans, sorry. But he was at this Catholic school in New Orleans, and he was basically advocating birth control and abortion. And so they didn't give him tenure, and they kicked him out of the university. And then Rockefeller, of course, who was pro-abortion, pro-birth control, brought him up to University of Chicago. So he had a clear animus against Catholics for not getting tenure at Tulane. In addition to that, he was a closet Stalinist. And as a closet Stalinist, when he was put on this committee, he didn't reveal his Stalinism to the Blanchard brothers or anybody on the committee. We only know this now from reading his diaries after his death. His diary, if anybody wants to do some reading this summer, you can go to the University of Chicago Library and read the diaries of Louis Wirth. But in his diaries, he lays out exactly how he's thinking through his participation. And a lot of the diaries are also, if you don't want to go to the University of Chicago, they are quoted in this book. But he lays out, he says, well, basically, the United States is becoming an empire. But the U.S. is a democratic, capitalist empire. But we have the same problem as the Soviet empire, the nationalities problem. The nice thing about the Soviets is that they can just use force to divide up the population. So the Czechs are in Vladivostok. We can keep 100,000 Czechs there. We got this problem with the Lithuanians in the northern part of Europe. Well, we can just take 300,000 Lithuanians and we can move them right into Siberia. Or we can just move people around in the Soviet Union because we have the power and we can do it. He says we can't do that in the United States because it's a free country. So we have to come up with a different way of ethnically cleansing the neighborhoods that could be, and the concern was the Polish, the Irish, the German, the Italian, all these neighborhoods, they might not be willing to go along with participation in another great war. Right? Because Catholics, we believe stuff like blessed are the peacemakers, right? That kind of stuff. And so how do we break up these, and also Louis Wirth and the others, they recognize the problem is we got to break up the lines of communication, right? they still understood that was a fundamental problem. We got to break the lines of communication. So the plan that they concocted was, well, there's this new institution, housing and urban development. So what we can do is we got to use the system to break up the neighborhoods. So they put together a plan. They said, we're going to move up sharecroppers from the south. Sharecroppers, they tend to be black. You also have white trash. Whether it's white or black, they have a higher rate of crime. So what we can do is we can move up sharecroppers from the south to the northern cities, especially where there are factories like Chicago and Detroit. Detroit was big on their list, was first on their list actually. And we can use the power of eminent domain. We can use real estate agents. And what we can do is we can use eminent domain, let's say, to take out 1,000 family homes. And so we have 1,000 families that are agitated because they're losing their homes. We can say this is all in the interest of urban renewal. Well, how do you create the need for urban renewal? You walk into a Polish neighborhood, which is immaculately clean. You knock over a garbage can and you take a picture of the garbage can that's been knocked over. And you say, see, this neighborhood is clearly in need of renewal. Right? It's dirty. The streets aren't being kept up the way they should. Literally, this is what they would do. Right? They would walk in, they would knock over a trash can, take a picture, and say, urban renewal. By the 50s and 60s, this is what's going on. And then they would say, then what you do is you take out 1,000 homes, but then also with the sharecroppers, you send them into that neighborhood. You promise them homes in that neighborhood. Then you build projects. Let's say you have 1,000 families you take out, you have 1,000 families you bring up, you build projects for 1,500 of them. So you create a shortage. In that shortage, you'll be violent. They hired a Swedish guy, Gunnar Myrdal, right, to write a book about how these ethnic groups are racist. Right? So you can pin the racist label on the ethnic group, and you can say, you see, it's the fault of the ethnic group, the racist ethnic identity. And then you have real estate agents show up, and you promise the ethnic group, you're going to get homes in the suburb. And part of their thought was, once they go to the suburb, we'll have broken the line of communication. Because in the suburb, they'll be more responsive to radio, television, and the author of The Virginian, I'm just blanking on his name right now, Owen Wister. As you do the analysis of Owen Wister and The Virginian, they start to cultivate the cowboy, but the identity of the cowboy now is someone who is not his identity becomes a white man like in Wyoming, or a white man in Idaho, a white man in some state who doesn't really have any attachments anymore. Right? And that's a whole nother interesting picture to look into. But part of what Louis Wirth thought, along with the Blanchard brothers, and it's interesting, right? Paul Blanchard became a public intellectual like a Tucker Carlson. And he spent his whole life writing against the fear of Catholic power. And it's kind of interesting. Paul Blanchard in the 50s and 60s, the Catholics welcomed him to their universities, like hook, line, and sinker. He's always being invited to Catholic environments to talk. Even though he was a bitter anti-Catholic. He thought the best thing the Catholics could all do is get on birth control. And he was being invited left and right to Catholic environments to speak. So they come up with this plan, and the first place they try it is in Poletown in Detroit. And it works. In a way it works, because it leads to violence. The first riots, 1943 riots in Detroit. In the 1930s, when there was migration happening, not as rapidly as it was happening in the late 1930s, early 1940s, because then it became more programmatic, more orchestrated, right? But in the 1920s and early 30s, when there were these problems of housing and whatnot in Detroit, there's articles written on this, there's books on this. The people, I mean, there was tensions, but the people kind of worked it out. It's only when the plans of Louis Wirth and the Blanchard brothers, it's when those policies got implemented that you get the first big riots in Detroit in 1943. But it kind of works, and Louis Wirth is happy, and he says, well, let's start imitating it. And what happens in Detroit, they start to imitate it in Chicago, and then it gets imitated in Philadelphia, it gets imitated in Cleveland, in New York, in Boston, in various degrees. The whole history of it, you can read about it. But the basic plan is the plan that Louis Wirth put together in the late 1930s as part of the committee of the Roosevelts that Roosevelt put together to try to address how do we resolve the nationalities problem. And fundamental to that committee was we think in the suburbs, people would become more, the people will get their information no longer from the diocese, from the parish. They'll get their information from Time magazine, from the radio, from the television. And so especially during and after the Second World War, you get the rise of this mass culture where you have 3 stations that give all the news and all the information. For example, the day John F. Kennedy was shot, it was Walter Cronkite. If you go to the JFK Museum or you watch the Walter Cronkite speaking about the assassination of JFK, that's the only information that people got on that day. Right? And everybody, in a way, the world was simpler, right? When it was 3 stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS. but the idea was that if we can break these means of communication, then we'll be able to establish a mass culture that will. Henry Luce, the owner of Time magazine, by the time he's doing his research in the 1950s on his magazine, he says, we've succeeded. That most Catholics get their news about the Catholic Church not from their diocesan newspaper or from their parish newspaper or their priest. They get their news about the Catholic Church from Time magazine. And in fact, many in this audience are probably aware of this phrase, the spirit of Vatican II. There was a young stringer for Time magazine named Michael Novak who coined the term, the spirit of Vatican II, which first appeared in Time magazine in 1963. And Michael Novak was the CIA guy who was working for Time magazine, because Time magazine was also in part a CIA operation by that point, right? So I guess, what does that tell you about the accusations that have come out against Tucker Carlson in Time magazine, right? Just in these last couple of weeks, right? Some things don't change. Well, they change a little bit because probably who the influencer has changed. But so the point was to break the communication of the church, to get the Catholic ethnics into the suburbs where they would become more subject to the mechanisms of mass culture and the images, right? Especially the categories of the mind that the experts of mass culture wanted to impose on them. One was the cowboy. The cowboy would replace Christ as the model or as the standard of behavior. I suppose after the Second World War, it'll become the soldier, right? But the cowboy, the soldier, well, also after the Second World War is the rise of the cowboy movie, really. Even though Gary Cooper in the 1930s is the first cowboy. So 2 final thoughts here before we start our conversation, if we want to have a conversation. One is that, again, as far as I can tell, the leadership in the Catholic Church was absolutely oblivious to these realities going on. Someone like Jacques Maritain at the University of Chicago, he was naive. Our Lord says you should be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. Well, they weren't just innocent as doves. They were naive. They were more naive than doves. They were clueless about the traps that were being set. What I think is interesting about our Lord's statement there, I think as a priest I can say something about the Gospels. I probably should, right? Right? I probably should say something about the Gospels. Right? Our Lord says you should be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And right after that, our Lord says they're going to persecute you. They're going to chase you from this town to this other town. They're going to run you here and there. Well, how do you put those things together? Because on the one hand, you might say, well, if you're wise as serpents, you'll avoid being persecuted. I don't think that's what our Lord meant necessarily. I think what he meant by being wise as serpents is the enemies of Christ, the world, the devil, the evil one, however you want to understand that, they're going to try to put you in situations where you will deny the faith. You will deny your faith in me, or you will sin. Somehow, rather than following me, you'll develop some other standard for your behavior, for how to think, for how to act. And that's the trap. You got to be innocent as doves is so long as you are following me, so long as you are articulating the truth and acting on it. Well then, yeah, you can be persecuted and you can accept it. But you don't want to be persecuted for false ideals. You don't want to be persecuted you don't want to be led into the traps to deny the faith. Right? So you got to be wise to see what are those traps and to avoid those. Right? Traps that could lead you into sin. Yes, obviously. But it seems like the people in those days, beginning with Jacques Maritain, and I would say a host of other Catholic intellectuals up until our own day, some of whom I named, that for whatever reason, they're very naive about the traps in the political order that are being set for them. And they end up becoming agents, really more of the political order of some political faction than really apostles or disciples of Christ promoting the truth in the public forum. And they also fail then our Lord also says he wants us to be good shepherds, especially priests, leaders. I think they fail to be good shepherds. Because a good shepherd, as Pope Benedict said when he became Pope, he said, pray for me that I'm strong enough to oppose the wolves. Right? A good shepherd knows the difference between a wolf and someone who is part of the flock and doesn't attack the flock or let the flock be eaten by the wolves. Right? That's like just simple terminology. And I think oftentimes the leadership, in the interest of getting their foot in the door with the elites of one sort or the other, they were blinded to the traps that were being set, not only for the faithful, but also for them, to deny the faith. So if there's a lesson that we can take out of it, I would say it's that, number one, there is value, there is a natural value to living around people who are like-minded. Right? Because just life is tough. But that does not mean creating a ghetto, right? That does not mean not interacting with the rest of society. That just means, well, for some fundamental things, it kind of helps to have people around you that can help you out, right? I mean, I think anybody that's part of a family knows this. And then number two, though, is that's not an obstacle to assimilating into the wider culture and trying to transform that culture according to our identity. And so anything we can do, right, to foster that healthy ethnic federalism I think is a good thing overall for our country and also for the church. And I will stop there. I'm sure there's other things we could say that we could discuss.
You kind of broached what I'm going to bring up, Father, but I just want to go into it a little bit deeper. What was in it for the bishops to go along with the agenda? Because that would mean that their power, I'm assuming that these guys like power,
Well,
that they're power hungry.
I think there's,
What was in it for them, and why didn't they realize, well, hey, my flock is paying more attention to the American government than to me, and there should have been alarm bells going off.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember Archbishop Dearden, or Cardinal Dearden.
Oh, yeah.
Of Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was a prime example of that.
Yeah.
Just liberal as all get out, and these guys from the '60s in the church, Bishop Vatican, saying, "Oh yeah, his old priests were pray, pay, and obey," but I don't see that anything's changed. So what flaw did a guy like Dearden have in his worldview, where he didn't realize that it was slipping away from him?
Right. Yeah, so the question here, I think it's two questions. One question just in general is, you go back to the First World War, what is it in the mentality of the bishops that leads them to so go along with Walter Lippmann's program, or programs like Walter Lippmann's programs, the patriotic move into World War I, and then in particular the Cardinal Dearden of Detroit. And I think many bishops in the Midwest in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, they really adopted this progressive leftist agenda. And I think if you go back to the First World War, there was a long-standing bitter anti-Catholicism among elites in this country. The whole rise of the Irish political machine was basically, part of it was that, well, you won't deal with us on fair terms. This is a democracy. We're gonna organize, and we're gonna force you to deal with us, just by our sheer voting power. And the bishops were trying. I think a good way of looking at it was that, again, going back to the Middle Ages, there's this notion that, well, the bishops, they are on an equal par with the politicians, and there's this deep-seated anti-Catholicism, and we got to do what we can to at least get our foot in the door and start talking to these people, because if we can start, I think you see this happening all the time. If I can at least talk with them, well, that gives me the good way of putting it would be, well, don't you want to convert souls to Catholicism? Don't you want to see the country become Catholic? Well, if I can just get my foot in the door with one of these Catholic leaders, and then he were to convert, well, then that would be like a huge thing for the country to become Catholic, right? So I think some of them would say, well, and it might not even have been fully conscious, but our going along with what the politicians are promoting on the thing of the war, right? The war is a gray, they would rationalize, the war is kind of a gray area. You can be for it or against it. Let's just be for it. And 10 years afterwards, we can settle the question of whether we should have been for it or not. But by being for it, we can at least get our foot in the door in dealing with these higher ups, the elites. Because if we can convert the elites, wouldn't that be awesome? I think some of them have this is always the case, right? This is always the case of how can we get our foot in the door? Like when I was in Rome in 2014, I was asked to go to this World Economic Forum conference in the Vatican. And again, some of the people that were organizing this conference, they were like, well, this is our chance to get our foot in the door with these corrupt, globalist, oligarchic elites, Don't you want crooked teeth like them, like theirs? And a lot of the professors at other Roman universities were like, why are we wasting our time with these people? You're not gonna, like, why even waste your time with these people? You're not gonna convert them. Now, someone in the Vatican told me, he was the guy that asked me to attend the conference. He said, look, at these conferences, all you can do is try to make 1 or 2 friends. It's usually not going to be the people in the limelight, but you can make 1 or 2 friends, and you make these 1 or 2 friends really so that someday, if it's needed, you can ask a favor for them. Like diplomat. So the approach from the Vatican, at least one fellow I knew in the Vatican at that time, his approach was, we just participate in these things because from a standpoint of diplomacy, eventually if you need a favor, a Catholic church is being burned in the country of this person, well, you can contact that person and say, hey, could you intervene for us to help put the fires out, type thing. So one reason for it is just, but that's a different reason even than, but one reason for participating in these things could also just be, well, just the more people you know, that just helps for diplomatic reasons. Right? It's thinking of the church as an international institution. I don't think the Catholic bishops on the eve of the First World War were thinking in that way at all. I think they were more like, again, there was also a strong current of Americanism. God created the American institutions. It's the wave of the future. And we have to adapt ourselves to the American institutions. So we need to enter into the elites and learn from them. And we need to teach the whole church. Right? America can instruct the church how to operate. And so we need to get in with the elites so the elites can teach us so we can teach the church. There were also others who were like that. Now I think that explains, again, I've never fully looked into this, but my sense is that already in the Roosevelt coalition in the 1930s, Roosevelt brings together the Catholics, the Democrats, the Communists, right? And the Jews. He farms out different areas of politics, society, and culture to different groups. So yeah, I'll let the Catholics develop some economic and political policies, the Social Security and whatnot. We'll give all the money for Hollywood and music. We'll give that to the Jews, basically, and the communists, because for Roosevelt that stuff doesn't matter, right? So so that's like the rise of the whole. All the communist folk music starts, all the economic communist folk music starts in the 1930s. Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie, all that whole morass, and. I think that what happens is that beginning in the 1930s, from the 1930s to the 1960s, the elites start to shift. And it is kind of weird how this happens more in the Midwest even than in the East Coast, where you get these radical shifts. And then as they radically shift, the Catholic leadership shifts with them. I think part of it is like that the Americanism. We have to identify where is the vital spirit. It's the vital spirit that's going to teach us. And so people like Dearden and others, they were probably raised in this environment of the vital spirit, right? Like a kind of leftist Americanism. And as the elites in the Midwest shifted in the 1960s and 70s, they shifted with them. That's my hypothesis at this point, and because there was a shift among the leftist leaderships, right? You see it here in Chicago. It happened in Detroit, and that's a whole other story. But so I think it was just a new version of Americanism and they just followed along.
So I have 2 questions. So one, like this Americanism that's happening with the church leadership, do you also buy the idea it's also a cultural anxiety? Like almost like an overcompensation for, we're the papists, like we came here in the 1850s, like the whore of Rome, so we're trying to assimilate into this American culture. Yeah,
I think so the question is this an overcompensation? This movement among the leadership in the 50s and 60s. When you read the literature, like I was at Notre Dame, and I was familiar with some of this, especially in academic, the history of Thomism, let's say in the 20th century. When you look at the history of Thomism in the 20th century, there's such a desire, in the late 50s, early 60s, there's such a desire to want to be accepted by the elite academic institutions that they feel there's elements of classical Catholic education that we need to jettison. We just need to get rid of it. And there's a real and one thing they really are embarrassed by is the rise of Thomism. I think there's a segment of Western elites, Germany, France, Italy, the U.S. There's a segment of the Western Catholic elites that were embarrassed that Thomism came back from the dead, and they just wanted to do anything and to this day it still exists. They're embarrassed by Thomism, and they want to do everything they can to just suppress it. And so it's an overcompensation in how they beat it down. I mean, I was a nothing professor at Notre Dame, and they became aware that I was a Thomist, and 6 out of the 12 years that I was there, I was almost fired. I got to meet deans. I got to meet the chairman of the department many times. I was constantly being harassed because I was a Thomist. And I was a nobody. Well, we'll go here first and then back to Ray.
Okay. No, one thing that I know, and we had discussed this before already. I remember a while back. I think it was leading up to the Trump election. There was some of you guys might remember Lipinski was running for office, a politician in Chicago, and he was the last pro-life Catholic Democrat. And I remember watching that and all the media that was behind it, and that kind of sea change that took place with the hot button issues. And growing up, you mentioned in Chicago, where I was born and raised, I watched. We were in ethnic groups that did vie for power and control of certain areas and certain trade unions, and but we all voted the same as Catholics, whether you were Italian, Irish, Mexican, Polish, and until that time, and then this sort of racial tension, ethnic tension came back. Do you think we're going through some sort of second slaughter of cities, another operation of sorts that's taking place in a digital landscape? That's kind of amplifying these things that used to happen.
So the question is, I'm just repeating it for. So the question is, are we going through a second slaughter of cities now in the digital world? One of the reasons I think we study the older versions is that if it was happening then, it's definitely happening now. But it's happening in a different form. So there has clearly, just in the last 2 weeks, I saw, for example, all the money that's being spent by Israel and Israel's allies in the United States to shape the digital platforms, right? The buying up of all the digital companies to control the message that's on them. Who can speak, who can't speak. Also, you see elements of, they're hiring bots. I think they're hiring bots to, for example, the cowboy is this guy that goes off to Wyoming or Idaho, and his identity becomes land, not religion. And you see these movements that I think are being promoted by the FBI of like the Catholic land movement, which is very similar to the cowboy, right? And so like there has to be there's plenty of, let's put it this way, there's plenty of evidence that they're using the digital, they're trying to control the digital platform as the new means of communication because it's replaced the 3 networks. They have to be onto it because you see the money, for example, the money the Israeli lobby is putting into trying to shape discourse with respect to Israel and the Iran war, right? They have to be. So one of the reasons for studying that it was done, I think, in the past, is that it's being done now in a different way. Then Ray?
Yeah. What is Thomism exactly? Because I see
Good.
the term thrown around, but I never really saw it.
Yeah, so the question is, what is Thomism exactly? So Thomism is the study of philosophy and theology using the principles that St. Thomas Aquinas used for the study of philosophy and theology. That would be the simple version of it.
Right.
Just a little historical picture would be that as of 1820, Thomism was dead. And in 1820 in Europe, we probably all remember from our history classes, Romanticism, 19th century Romanticism. We got to go back to the past to see if there's principles or practices or if there's something from the past that we've missed out on for the last 500 years. And then we got to see, is there a way we can revitalize it and make it adaptable, make it current in our situation, in our circumstances. So one thing that happens beginning in the 1820s, a number of scholars in Europe, they go back to the Middle Ages and they discover St. Thomas Aquinas. And they basically start to apply the principles that St. Thomas Aquinas used in philosophy, in theology, in economics, in politics, in all the areas of social and political life. And that leads to the rise of Thomism. In the 1870s, Pope Leo XIII writes an encyclical, Aeterni Patris, encouraging the use of Thomism in all Catholic seminaries. I think he has the idea that what we've started of recovering the principles that St. Thomas Aquinas used for approaching the world, right? That's going to be the best way for approaching modern developments and purifying them, rather than just blindly accepting modern developments. And so in the 1920s, it took a long time, it took 50 years or so, but in the 1920s, pretty much every Catholic university starts to produce books for teaching philosophy and theology according to the principles of St. Thomas. And that kind of gets going into the so for example, my dad went to the University of Detroit in the 1950s. He took 8 philosophy classes because every student had to take 8 philosophy classes. And they were all based in Thomistic philosophy. And that's what so many people in the 1960s and 70s hated, especially in Catholic environments, and did everything they could to get rid of.
I don't see what the beef was with I'm a little bit acquainted with the SUMA.
Yeah.
I can't see what their beef is. It's just, well, what were their criticism? And they're against Aristotelianism too.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a rejection of Christianity.
Yeah, so he's saying in a broad way it is a rejection of Christianity, right?
Yeah. With a label, simple label, because I'm a simple person. And if we're no longer teaching Thomism through the major universities and schools, what brand are we on now?
So the question is, if we're no longer teaching Thomism, what brand are we on? It would be university by university. I know in many places we've adopted what's called analytical philosophy. In some places we've adopted continental philosophy. So analytical philosophy would be a kind of specialized logic. Just making sure everything is logical. Continental philosophy would be more existentialism, more thinkers that are following Friedrich Nietzsche, the existentialists, trying to come up with new systems that could replace the Christian system of thought.